everyone. Welcome to the first session of SourceCode. Thank you so much for the overwhelming love and attention that you gave us. We had a very hard time deciding who all we should invite into the session. We have Joydeep and Anoop supposed to be curating the content of the session, and we hope all of you walk back with some actionable steps and frameworks and mental models to take your businesses to the next level. For introductions, Anoop most recently led the product management team at GitLab. When GitLab was going public, over the last 11 years, he has worked in product teams at GitLab, Hive, which was acquired by Extreme Networks, MapR, which was acquired by HPE. During this time, he has built products to cater to enterprises, SMB, mid-market, pretty much across data, AI, developer tools, SaaS, open source, and infrastructure. He really enjoys product-led and sales-assisted GTM models and has a strong experience in company building, especially when making remote and async companies successful. He's currently on a short break from full-time roles and is using his time to advise, fund, and enable the next generation of disruptors. The session will be curated by Joydeep. Joydeep is the co-founder and CEO at ClearFeed.ai. He was earlier the CTO and co-founder at Qbol, where he scaled the company from zero to over $50 million in ARR. In an earlier life, he founded the Apache Hive project and ran the data infrastructure team at Facebook. He currently lives in Bangalore and enjoys mentoring early stage startups at the same time. With that, over to you, Anoop and Joydeep, for the session.
Thank you, Pratyush. Thank you, Joydeep. Thank you, everyone, for taking this time. And I hope we make this interactive. I think the real nuances and textures of open source are very specific to the situation at hand. But there are some general lessons that I'm sharing here, and then we can debate them because they also keep changing as the world changes. So before we get into that, there is always this, why do you want to be an open source business? And I think this, personally, having worked with founders who are very strong open source advocates and those who had also very strong closed source roots, I know that this is an important question for all of you as founders to deeply sort of internalize and answer. And just if you want to, just put on in chat what your reason is, if it's one of these four, and if it's all of the above or combination. I would love to understand where you are and why you want to do it. All right, differentiated and easier, helps me recruit. Yeah, those are great reasons. There are strong beliefs in certain sectors today that all enterprise software should be open source. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. It gives a lot of autonomy to companies as startups go through various changes. So for instance, somebody might make a bet on you and then you get acquired, and the terms of the acquisition are hard for the company that now uses your product and things like that. So they feel like there is a great, even as customers, they prefer to have an open source model. It certainly can be differentiated. It definitely helps recruit and retain talented employees. And from what I have seen, open source software also keeps the company honest. You get really good feedback. And although oftentimes we share the good stuff with our sales and marketing team and internally to rally our morale, it's also important to look at a more balanced view, and having an open source system fosters that. If you can, just share any open source companies you admire. That'll give me some context of your background and what you like. I've put my list here. I've left a lot of them out too, but just want to share, see if you have some. Netflix and Google, certainly interesting selections. Sentry, indeed. And then share some open source companies you think missed the mark. And I've included all Hadoop vendors here, having actually lived through that journey. NGINX, which I think is a great web server, Anaconda, but you might have others. Great. Cool. The reason I share them is, there are some things people are doing right and some things people are doing wrong. And we can sort of dive into what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong here. One quick lesson that I've learned is, if you are an open source product having the center of gravity be together in one company is extremely useful. There may be other contributors into your open source or working for other companies, but as long as they're not selling the same open source product and commercializing it, makes a huge difference. And you'll see that in the success and in many of the companies you all mentioned and admire, you will see that the center of gravity is with one company. MongoDB, it's with Mongo company, Confluent, Sentry, Databricks, and so on and so forth. And then when you look at um, uh, the lack of success, like Hadoop vendors, it was distributed, so we were all chasing the same pie, and that makes it hard. Anyway, so going to where the open source, like should you even do it, and where you get the biggest bang for the buck. I'll walk you through this Venn diagram just a little bit to explain. So one circle is the users of the product, who is actually using the product. The second is who is buying the product. And these can be the same, but these often are not the same in enterprises. And then is there a builder involved? And a builder here could be a developer if they're using a development product, a designer who's using a designer product, a user researcher who's using UX product, and so on. Or same thing for data. And if you look at the intersection of all three, where the product user is a builder and is also a buyer, you get the maximum resonance of your open source software. This is true for all build and dev tools. This is true for a lot of security tools. This is true for the design tools. This is true for Mongo, Confluent, Elastic. Now, I'll caveat that by saying, certainly, as you look at large enterprises, the buyer changes here. The buyer is not necessarily the person who's using Kafka or using Mongo. But as companies bootstrap and get their early wins, the SMB mid-market user and builder are often the same. And even within enterprises, the first wins are in small teams or small groups, and there the user builder and the buyer is often the same. So you get to get in there, seal the deal, plant the seeds, and then grow from there. And then as you go out, the benefits become less tangible from a business point of view, purely from a GTM sell point of view. There are still clear and concrete benefits of being open source otherwise. Product user is a builder with influence, but not necessarily a buyer, which we talked about as you go into enterprise. Or a product user is a buyer, but is non-technical user. So is Notion open source? No. Will we get most of the Notion users to consider a product if it's open source? Probably not. But will we get the developer Notion users to consider it? Probably yes. And then can they influence others? Probably yes. So, your path sort of changes. And a product builder is the buyer, but not the user. I wasn't able to find any examples, so I just left that diagram out there just as it is. Sorry. So then coming back to after you've looked at that thesis, and let's say you're not in the number one quadrant, then it's fair to question, like, should I still do it? And I would say don't do it if you believe in these following things. And I personally think these are misgivings. So we can walk through that, why I think these are misgivings. But if you think that, deep dive for your own purpose and decide whether they are truly correct for you. So one is it's a tax. I have to do all this stewardship and governance for this open source project, especially if it's like in Apache or other places where there are certain requirements. Yes, you do spend time on that, but you get a lot of value out of it. You get a lot of discipline out of it. You get to leverage the community. You understand how consensus can be made. You are able to work with voices outside your company, and that back and forth communication skill set that the company develops is healthy as you get into sales negotiations and things like that. It'll help my customers, and then I'll change it, right? I'll keep it open, and then at one point I'll become too big to fail, and then I'll make it closed. Don't do that. I mean, it's just bad from a form perspective. You will lose credibility. with customers and they have long memories. You'll lose credibility in the industry as well. Now, having said that, there are ways to deal with it. You can always say, after a certain point, certain radically new improvements could be closed source as add-ons or could be under a different license. So it's understandable that we need some protections so that people can't just copy and go, especially cloud vendors. But there are other ways to do it. You don't have to have a blunt instrument. There are lots of nice, nuanced ways which customers actually appreciate and will suggest you as well. I don't need to engage the community. I'll build my open source. The source is available and that's good. Well, yeah, that doesn't get you a lot of benefits of the open source. One of the big benefits is having other people's eyes on it and having other people's opinions on it. You would be surprised how many people deeply will care about your success outside your company if you run open source well. They will come and give you suggestions on what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. They will, in fact, help you get breaks because they like what you're doing and they believe in the value you're giving to the community. So yeah, you definitely have to engage community. Oh, if it's open source, people can see my best engineers and then they will poach them. Well, if you have a good engineer, Valley, or even I think in India, the world is small. People can quickly find out who the good engineers are. So they're going to try to push them anyway. This is not the reason to not do open source. In fact, here you're giving them a legacy. As they eventually form their new companies or lead another company, they can show others what they built. And that's a great asset for them to have. It's actually a reason to attract talent, not to lose talent. When I'm engaging with the community, I'll just have a non-tech community person. This is probably, this has happened a lot in the Bay Area early on, but I think people have learned their lesson. Think Kelsey Hightower as a community evangelist, right? To me, he's sort of the gold standard. But early on, it's the people who are building the product. They should be engaging with the community. If I build an open source project, it will distract me for building for the user. That's possible. A lot of time, open source products are not good at user experience, right? So that's something you have to watch out for and incorporate very well. So you have to be thoughtful about how you do that. It'll make me hard to negotiate and charge the customer because it's open source. Why do I have to pay it? It's already there. Yeah, well, this used to happen a lot early on, but most companies now understand that there is a lot more than just source code. There is support, there are extensions, there are enhancements, there is managed service, there is domain expertise, there is the ability to have a conversation and understand how to use the product well. And if you don't have any of those things, you can't really function with just open source. And often people who do that end up spending a lot more money by hiring engineers who are supporting all that. And it's cheaper to just sign up for your program and plan. With that, it comes with its responsibilities. It is a commitment. But remember that with that responsibility, you get a community which will help you, champion you during the darkest of times and help you find solutions. Once you open source a particular piece of software, don't close source it. We talked about it. Once you make a feature functionality free, don't make it paid. You can add extensions. And the great thing about enterprise software is there's always the next thing to do to add value. There is always more you can do to make things simple and easy. And so when you get to those things, you can charge for those. You don't have to go back and say, oops, I made this free. Now I'm going to change it to paid. If you end up doing that early in your cycle, then you can sort of make sure your existing customers don't get zipped by that. You give them a special sort of license so that they don't have to. But net new customers, it's a new contract, it's completely new rules. You can get away with it. You do get a lot of chances to experiment with monetization in early stages. But the important thing to note here is be open with your customer as you're doing that, right? Hey, I'm trying this. This is our pricing right now. Great. But if you change it, make sure your existing customers are taken care of in some way, shape, or form so that they don't feel that you change pricing on them in a negative way. And especially for startups early, even if you have 100 customers, 99.5% of your customer base is in your future. It's not those 100 customers. So often people try to um, extract the maximum from their early customers. And I think that's often a mistake. These are your champions, right? You want to take care of them. You definitely want to charge them appropriately. But as you change pricing policies, you make sure that they don't get impacted negatively. The other thing is like the 3 Ds to avoid is deny, deflect, defend. When there are problems in your code, and I love the example from GitLab here. This was prior to my time at GitLab, but I don't know how many of you know, we have a SaaS, we had an early SaaS offering, and the system went down because somebody deleted the database. And in response, what GitLab did is we did live YouTube video stream, and everybody saw that GitLab was working on fixing it and how GitLab approached it in a blameless manner amongst the team members and then fixed it. You can spend a lot of money on marketing, or you can be honest with your community and you will get many fold of goodwill from your community. So don't deny, don't deflect, don't defend when mistakes happen. Embrace them, be honest about them, and share transparently whether you're planning to fix them or not. A community respects that a lot more than just the corp speak that they've historically gotten from old world enterprise companies. And that's sort of, and that goes with open source. There is this expectation that you will be like that. Then let's go to quickly monetization. I'm just going to quickly cover the basics. Historically, open source has been best monetized as SaaS. And by historically, I mean the last 10 open source companies that have gone public, right? I'm not looking at Red Hat. It was from an era pre-SaaS, although they are also figuring out other ways to do it. Open source doesn't have to mean support only low margin business. In fact, you have to decide often very early that you're not going to accept those. Sometimes sometimes it's okay to say in some of your cases, if you want to run the product and you only want to pay me for support, Mr. Customer, don't pay me for support. Go ahead, run the product for free, and you can get community support. But if you're willing to then sign up a proper subscription contract with me, then you can come and do it. It's a dicey thing, but as you go through your system and you know the value you're adding for your customer, you will be able to articulate why that's important. Not everything has to be built in open source. Just because you're an open source company, it's not a 1 or a 0. What's important is to be very, very clear and disciplined and consistent in what will be and won't be in open source. And we can do some Q&A here, but essentially, being very opportunistic is not a great way to do it. Being values driven and a theme driven approach is much better. So for example, at GitLab, we have tiers and we have buyer-based tiering model, which means anything that a developer wants to do their job is free. The moment a set of developers want to collaborate together and a team lead or a team manager needs certain things, well, then those become in the premium tier. And when you want to embrace GitLab as an organization, anything that the organizational leaders need, setting up consistent policies across the organization for security and so on, well, those capabilities are in ultimate tier. So we have resisted oftentimes this thing where for a particular sales deal, a salesperson might think that if only this new feature that you're developing would be in a higher tier, I know the customer will pay for it. And they are correct. The customer might pay for it. But you can't do third-degree price discrimination in these sort of market models. So you have to be consistent. And open source developers generally more adapt with all remote work culture, right? Linux was not developed in a single office, and that's true for many of the early sort of foundational open source softwares. And that culture sort of helps us build distributed teams. Advanced, uh, your recipe for early success breaks once you stop putting key capabilities in free open source tier. So sometimes people say, I'm going to do 1 year of open source and then everything else will be in paid tier. You have to have a responsible policy to keep giving to your community, whatever that stewardship promises. Your SMB mid-market techniques in open source may not work for enterprises, but you can overcome that. You should have a really strong handle on how much, if you run a SaaS free tier, how much you're costing. Oftentimes in the rapid scaling, you might make suboptimal decisions on costing, which is fine as long as you have a handle, right? You're not doing it unknowingly. And think about instrumentation and data gathering upfront. It can get complex in open source systems depending on the licenses and things you use. And it's important to understand what customers are willing to pay for and how much. And that's an art regardless of whether you're doing an open source company or not, but it's really important to know in an open source company. And expert mode, measure KPIs, your CAC, your LTV, your conversion funnel, monthly actives, even if you have 2 customers, right? Keep that measurement going because that will start to bring the foundation of a business mindset to you. Differentiate the paid CAC from organic CAC. Often people do blended CAC when they talk to investors. That's fine. But for you as a founder, you should know what sort of customer acquisition channels are the most effective and why. Community building is critical. Free hosting costs can add up. We talked about it. And train everyone on how to engage with the community, especially in the early days. It's the more, if you want to create that excitement, you want the entire company to the extent possible engaging with the community. And that excitement will sort of help everybody else feel the excitement as well. So that's, and then in general, be proactive with sharing your open source strategy around monetization, community contribution, and licensing. You have to share with your community what you're going to do before you do it. Otherwise, they don't feel part of your decision-making process. And so it's important to do that. And those are the slides. I'm going to pause and see if there are questions and discussions.
Perfect. I think Joydeep might have a few specific points that we can deep dive into. And meanwhile, the attendees, if you have any questions that you might want us to take, please drop them in the chat. Else, there is a Slido link here as well, where you guys can share your questions or upvote some of the other questions which the fellow attendees have asked. Again, put the link of the Slido in the chat for everyone to see. Over to you, Joydeep.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot, Anoop. That was really great. While you were speaking, I had a lot of new questions pop up in my mind. So I particularly, loved the Venn diagram of the build, buyer, and the user. Since we already have context around monetization, let me start from that because we just you spent some excellent points around it. So, what is your view on a monetization model that includes like support kind of stuff? Because that's kind of natural, right? A lot of companies run open source, and we'll get a little bit deeper into I think some patterns that are emerging of building open source sort of equivalents of SaaS offerings. And oftentimes the driver is sort of, hey, I want to run this myself, and support is a very natural monetization model. What has been your experience in this regard?
Yeah, so I don't consider support as a long-term sustainable model of building a product company, but as you're bootstrapping, I think it's all good because you will get to engage with customers. They will run it. You'll find out what sort of support challenges they run into. It'll help you improve your product, and you get some revenue in that. So that's all fine, but try to articulate why This is more than just support. And for example, oftentimes that's why the paid tiers usually have capabilities that a company needs to run versus an individual. If I'm a 2 or 3 person developer, I can use whatever I want. But the moment I have a business and I'm making some revenue and I'm using your product, I have some responsibilities, fiduciary, legal, compliance responsibilities to my organization. So if I can make those sorts of capabilities in the paid tier, then it's just natural. And with the paid tier, you also get support, obviously. But you now have a licensed, you now have a subscription, which is more than just support.
Makes sense, right? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You just sort of license the paid tier and get support. So that actually brings me to another question in the same sort of class of discussion, which is that, if I make a open source equivalent of some really popular sort of SaaS service, right? And we are seeing a lot of that these days. One of the things that driving at least some users is, hey, I can run this in my VPC inside my firewall, and data doesn't go out, and so on and so forth, right? So that goes against the SaaS, or can go against the whole SaaS, sort of at least the multi-tenant SaaS model. So you've had some experience in this regard. I think you've mentioned that GitLab probably also does accommodate these. So I would love to hear from you a little bit on how to accommodate and how to monetize this particular pattern.
Yeah. So what I'll say is, we have heard from customers at GitLab that they want something like this. And GitLab, since GitLab also has a self-managed model, customers often just do their self-managed, but they would love to have GitLab host this in the VPC for them, for example. But broadly, like if we go broader, you will notice that many companies now have figured out a way to do this for their customers. And from my research, I see that they are charging a premium for this. So you can come and run in my multi-tenant SaaS environment, which also has a lot of great isolation and security built in. But if you want me to run my search cluster or my database cluster or my streams cluster in your environment, in your VPC, I'm happy to run that as a managed service in your VPC, where you own all the administration as it relates to your use cases. But I, as a vendor, own uptime, SLOs, upgrades, patching, all those things. And you can make a lot more money out of it. So because it's a valuable service, and they also gain value from it. So those models are rapidly evolving, but there are now many vendors doing this, and they call it dedicated. They call it, I think that's typically the word they use, but like if you go to Elastic's website in Mongo, you will see those models as you go through it.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, we have a limited time here. I'd love to someday learn about how people go about building this, but maybe that's a topic in itself. I wanted to talk a little bit more about SaaS. One of the experiences I had was that SaaS at enterprise B2B, particularly for very mission critical sort of applications, is not simple. It is something that has to be taken very seriously and has to be built right, and so on. So there is a risk, I feel, that if you're an open source company, that SaaS effort could detract from your energies of first building the core offering, the community, and so on. So again, would love to get some thoughts from you on this topic. What's the right time to build out your SaaS tier? I don't know if there's sort of things that you went through at GitLab, and in terms of timing and scope and so on, would be really useful to learn something here.
Yeah, I think at GitLab and also at MapR, we were actually super early one time, and then there was nobody who was willing to use it, and then we shut it off, and then we started again when the timing was right. So Jyodeep, you're absolutely right. There is a whole lot of scaffolding that goes into taking your open source software and then making it SaaS. And I would even say it's more than scaffolding. It starts off with scaffolding, but there's like proper serious engineering involved in doing this. And some of it, you could open source all of it too. I wish there was an open source company that actually did that, but that's a separate topic, which can just take your service and do everything for it. Um, but it can distract you from building your product and solving customers' problems, especially if the customers are completely willing to take it and onboard it into their cloud or their on-prem systems. So what's my advice? This is a tough one. I think a general advice is hard, but I would say try to get to your product market fit first if you can, and then go to SaaS. And your customers will also drive you there. You will start hearing a loud sound from it. And then, well, now it's time because they are asking me for it and they're willing to work with me to actually get that done.
Cool. Okay, so I think let's shift gears a little bit. There's a couple of questions from the audience, which I also had in my list. So we'll go back to the open source and, some questions around the open source ecosystem. So I think the questions have been, and I had the same one, is to get some thoughts from you on the new age licenses, right? So I think in your presentation, the thrust was, hey, like be sort of like truly open source and, don't go closed source and so on. But, we are seeing a couple of things. One is the cloud vendors, obviously, for successful projects, getting into direct conflict with the the open source provider. That's one. Second, I think there's a continual tension in open source communities where somebody contributes something that you want in a paid tier, right? But somebody comes in and just contributes that and makes that free, right? And then so there is this conflict, right? And people are using these server-side licenses and AGPL and all this stuff to sort of continue to have a commercial foothold while they give away the code for free, right? What has been your experience and what are your thoughts right now? What would you advise?
Yeah, I think this is one thing where we have seen this in GitLab as well, but we made it really clear and we have documented it, if I remember, in the handbook, which is that if a feature or capability is in a certain buyer tier, it will stay in that buyer tier. So if you take if you submit a contribution that brings it into the free tier, we respectfully refuse that contribution and we point them to the community guidelines. And why we are able to do that because we have that sort of a licensing mechanism built in place. I don't know how you would do that in an Apache system if there are lots of committers outside.
It's not possible in Apache. So that's a very interesting point. So basically, Apache is sort of incompatible with that kind of a stance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So yeah, find a license that is compatible with it. I would also say in this case, having said that, I would say don't prematurely engineer your license because there is now a path. And like you all have seen, we know the path, but get to it when you need to. If you have a problem where a cloud vendor is really eyeing your software to run their own service, you're already winning. And at that point, you have the center of gravity, you have the engineers, and then you can change the license and run away from them within like months, and they will not be able to catch up, at least easily.
Cool. Okay. So also around open source, you talked about how you should, community is important, right? Don't just do open source for the sake of open source, actually, develop the community and so on. I had a couple of questions around that. First of all, how would you, let's say you were investing in a company or evaluating a company, how would you measure the health of the community and therefore of the open source project? What metrics would you use? There's a lot of vanity metrics around stars and so on GitHub. I mean, is that the entirety of it, or is it a more comprehensive thing?
Yeah. So a few things are, first of all, the way I look at it is, what is the internal community versus the broad community, right? So if you are open source, there is a subset of the community inside your company. And then hopefully there are people outside your community contributing. So first of all, generally the health of the open source, you can see by the contributions, the rate of change and things like that. How many lines of code, how many people are doing it? Are there only a few people that are dominating all the contributions, or is it fairly well spread, right? You want a more spread out system over time. Early on, of course, there'll be a few engineers, but as you hire more, then are there external contributors to the system, and how often are they contributing, and how many contributions are they doing? That is also super clear and super important. It's really hard to have that early on, right? So that's okay. How many how many communications are happening on the forums and things like that? You can bring that in-house. So one of the interesting things about it is it's really important to create a systemic method to bring all the conversations into a single place. Because otherwise, some people on Hacker News, and some people on Reddit, and some people on your forums, and some people inside your Slack, and then it becomes a very fragmented communication. So have a systemic way to bring everybody to the same forum. So for example, if there is a thread that's going on Reddit, you can say, great point, we have this issue here in Jira or whatever, and we have detailed explanation of what the problem is and what we want to solve. So then you bring that person back into that issue.
Got it.
And then you can measure all of that. You can also, there are also third-party tools that give you capabilities to sort of find out all the conversations happening on most of the common social platforms, and you can measure how that's going up and down, and also the tonality of that. You can see if those conversations are positive or are getting negative, and that can also signal to you how the community is doing.
Right.
So I think stars and forks and clones are great, but you want to get the other contribution metrics as well.
Right.
And often those are early indicators, and then you get the real contributions.
Right. So, one of the things that I saw in my journey was that it's not just enough to put the code out there, and even to, like, let's say, have an online forum and so on. But to a certain extent, putting some investment in getting in front of people through various forums and so on actually matters a lot. So wanted to again get some sense from you that beyond doing the online stuff, like how would you advise people to grow the community beyond just sort of starting a Slack forum and putting things on GitHub, for example?
Yeah, I think that's the bootstrapping is probably one of the hardest parts of doing that. And although I don't know if there is a single playbook. Pre-COVID, there used to be these amazing ways to get early like-minded people together with an open mind. So even if you're talking about your open source project, sort of cast a white tent about the problem itself, not just about your open source project, and get everybody who's solving that problem together. That then starts the conversation. And from there, you can then, each one can share their own perspective and point of view. And eventually the best ideas sort of bubble up, and hopefully they get into your program and project. And then slowly but surely you build a sort of traction in that area. The second thing is, it's really important to understand that it requires it's not a one and done. You do it once and it's gone. So if you can build an operating system for your community that has at reasonable cadences, fresh information and fresh exciting problems to be solved, shared, then you can keep the community engaged. I wouldn't say it's like use all the Facebook techniques to keep us engaged on our app to be applied to open source, but the core principles of sharing interesting, delightful, relevant information, giving that, and then having excitement around it helps others come along for the ride. And then as you get customers or even prospects or even just users, instead of you being the spokesperson, give them a forum to have their own voice. That works even better. And it's more amazing when somebody who's using your product is talking about it. And
Right.
then that makes a huge difference as well.
Right. Great. So I think we have some audience questions as well, but hopefully we'll get to them. I'll just wrap up, some of the other one or two things I had listed out. So I want to again sort of shift gears a little bit. We talked a little bit about remote teams, and you mentioned how open source is fundamentally about a distributed community. It was true pre-COVID also, but I think post-COVID it's going to be even more true. Um, I also had a long experience, running a remote team, and I wanted to ask you about a few things. One that I found particularly hard was that when you have teams all over the world, people join up, but eventually everybody looks for a career path and some sense of progress and so on. And at least historically, certain growth paths have been very physically sort of co-located in nature. Like, if I want to become an engineering manager, you typically sort of find somebody who's sort of local, who sort of leads a team and so on, right? And those kind of career paths become very difficult when you are fragmented all over the world. So how did you guys, first of all, what problems did you face? And if you face this problem or you saw this, how would you deal with, how did you deal with these kind of issues?
Yeah, I think faced this problem multiple times, failed a few times uh, for all these reasons that you mentioned and constraints we put on ourselves around the problem set. Oftentimes it's about like, I think this is not going to work, so I'm not even going to try it situation. Um, but GitLab was a great sort of place for me to learn and embrace that. Um, First of all, I think to me, async work is a precondition for remote work. So if in your company you can get to a point where most of your conversation or deep communication is happening asynchronously, even if you're in the same time zone, um, whatever that recipe is, it's going to help you uh, become remote. So for example, at GitLab, we consider that sync time, just as a thought experiment, right? Assume sync time is 10 times more expensive than async, whether it's true or not, for the sake of this conversation. If it is, then if I want to, it's very easy for me to say, hey, Joydeep, I have a question. Let's get a conference room and talk about it. And then before we know, 15 minutes are gone, right? But if it's a 10 times more expensive, I should think about it not as 15 minutes. It's 15 minutes of you and 15 minutes of me. 30 minutes times 10, it's 300 minutes of human capital wasted or expended. Well, maybe I should formulate my problem and write it up clearly and succinctly. And just by the way, the act of writing makes us very, very crisp about the problem we are thinking about. And then I send it to Joydeep and I say, Joydeep, here is a problem I'm facing. What do you think? And in that doc, Joydeep replies when he has time. And then I go back and look at his response, and I have a follow-up question and I ask it. And then Joydeep does it back to me. Now, I may not need this sync time, but it might have taken me 45 minutes to write that document. But 45 minutes plus 15 minutes of back and forth with Joydeep is still 60 minutes of time, and it's all async, right? So what looks inefficient over time becomes efficient. Why? Because now this question and answer and this thought process, by the way, is written down. A third person comes into the conversation, Pratyush, and he has the same question 2 months later because he just joined the team. Or he can go and look at that conversation, including the back and forth. In 5 minutes, he knows the answer. We don't have to meet again for 15 minutes and explain it to Pratyush. So as the company scales, this habit of writing down pays itself forward in many, many ways. And then you can then use that as a foundation for async, with managers being a remote separate location than the actual person. And now at the same time, I say remote and async first, not only, which means there will be a time and a place for sync. And if you're remote, one of the advantages is you get to be where you are. One of the things you can ask your employees is, well, once a week, you and your manager have to find a time that may be mutually inconvenient instead of mutually convenient. But that's once a week for trust building and relationship building. But all your work is happening async anyway.
Got it. Cool. That's very useful. I think ever since I learned about the Amazon, sort of, come to the meeting with the, everything sort of written down and spend 10 minutes reading. I was so impressed. I think you're sort of highlighting the same point, right? For in general for OSS communities and remote work as well. So that's really great. Hey, thanks everybody for all the questions you're sort of filing away. So Pratyush is coordinating. He's sending some of them my way, and I'm trying to sort of loop them into like whatever I had. So please keep them coming. So there was a question on the Zoom chat room around distribution channels, and to get your thoughts on what kind of distribution channels work best for those different sort of segments of your Venn diagram. I think that Venn diagram was really nice. I think a lot of people are latching onto that. I had a similar question that like a lot of one of the let me rephrase the question in a way that sort of comes to me is PLG and community-led growth is all bottoms up, right? So you want your users to adopt you, and then oftentimes they take you into their company, and you sort of monetize it and so on. But for large companies, I've also seen that may not be enough, right? You also sometimes have to go top down. I think I would say that organic and paid are the two primary ways, right? And you've already sort of segmented that out, right? So when should people go top down? Do they need to go top down, or is bottoms up good enough? Did GitLab go top down? Are you also having a direct sales force going to large companies and selling directly? Would love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can answer the second question first. Yes, GitLab did go eventually top down. And I think Mongo has a case study, if you can get your hands on it. I think it was in Stanford that the case study was built. It's a great one to look at, where they also eventually went top down. The interesting thing is, if your product is being used in 5 different groups in a large company, or 50 different groups in a large company, each one has transacted individually with you. Maybe 10 of them are paying, 40 of them are not paying. And if you have that information, which is why I talked about instrument first, then there will be a point in time where you can then go top down, and you can go to the CIO and say, did you know that 50 of your teams are using it? 10 of them are using it properly with security and compliance. 40 of them are just using open source. How about we bring them all together under the single umbrella and actually make it part of your central services or what have you? And they are often more interested in doing that. And by the way, as we are doing this, are there other team members that want it, and do you want to expand the deal, and so on and so forth? So yes, that happens, that works. It happens a little bit later in the life cycle. Bootstrapping is always hard. I can give you an advice, but I would always caveat that by you have to hustle and try all sorts of things in many shapes of form, and you will find your own way, which will be probably is slightly unique for yourself. Having said that, if you can get to the aha moment in as frictionless way as possible for your customer around the value your product provides to the user, that is golden. How you do that and how you make it easy, that's where all the trick lies. Oftentimes I've been in places where we built something wonderful but hide it behind a paywall. All of a sudden we took 90% of our user base and we just eliminated them, because 90% of the nobody likes to go and put 5 different pieces of information before downloading a document which says that your product is great. And to be honest, why should I spend 10 minutes reading a document to understand your product is great? Wouldn't it be nice if I could just spend 5 minutes on your product and experience it for myself? And now I know your product is great. And then everything else will follow. Then I'll read 40 more pages of documents to understand the details, because now I'm hooked and I know you can solve my problem. So I would say find that. And as you find that, then you can figure out what the distribution channels are, because it will guide you. If you see that the appeal to the user works better, great. If you see the appeal to the buyer works better, that's fine too.
There's an interesting question, I think that came on Slido. I'll try to paraphrase this. It's a difficult to paraphrase, but let me try my best. So I think the question is saying that there are often two categories. One is where budgets already exist in IT departments, and the other one where budgets don't exist. And would you suggest if open source would be an effective strategy to sort of create a budget, right? Like create a category of software or category of use cases which did not exist before and for which there was no budget. Um, I'm not sure the example given here is a great one. I think Kafka is an enterprise service bus and there's always been budgets for those. But the question is interesting. I would just sort of see if you have any take on that.
Yeah, I can interpret the question two ways, right? Is there a place where people will have an open source budget? And I think my answer to that is probably unlikely. Businesses think in terms of problems to be solved for them, not in terms of like, unless it becomes like a social good where they have budget for a social good, and yeah, under that they might have some small budget for open source, but then it will never be material enough for us to build a massive company out of it. So I think not, if that was the question. If the question is, can open source be a great way to solve a problem that's not in the budget today, but it will be in the budget later because people see that as a real problem? Yeah, I think so. That happens all the time. There used to be a enterprise bus budget long time ago. I don't know how many of you have heard of TIPCO, right?
Right.
And then it wasn't, because it was only doing point to point and it was solving some problems. And Kafka comes along and does a totally different thing, right? It's like, I won't call it enterprise bus because it is so much more than that. And people found budget for it because they were able to solve a problem. And the way to find the budget is find the business problem you're trying to solve and go to the person that owns that problem. And they will find a budget if you're genuinely solving that problem. So I wouldn't like get too focused on, is there a budget or not? The question is there a real business problem that you can solve? And is that problem going to help the customer actually make more money, save more money, reduce risk? Foundationally, those are the three high-level buckets. Or innovate, right? Make more money through some massive innovation, for example. It all comes down to those three most of the times.
There's a question from Slido again with a few upvotes. Great question. I would just read it out as it was stated. When is open source not the right approach to take while building a bottoms-up SaaS tool targeted at developers? So when is open source not the right tool, particularly if you're targeting developers? Is it ever not the right tool if you're targeting developers? Actually, I would ask it that way, but let me, yeah, definitely, yeah.
When is it ever? It's a great question. I think it's okay not to expose your underlying code if you think you have created something that has enduring differentiation over a long term, and it's going to take somebody so long to replicate it that you might as well then keep it closed source, right? So you discovered this amazing way of doing things. Usually it takes a long time, because imagine if I'm sure all of you are great software developers. There are others who are learning from you. So eventually they will become great software developers. And if you were able to solve something with 5 engineers, they might throw 50 engineers at the problem and solve it. And so is there an enduring, long-term, sustainable, massive differentiation? Well, yeah, then keep it private, and that differentiation will give you a lot of dividends and a lot of moat. Patent it, do what you want to do with it. But those have become rarer and rarer, and in infra it's possible. I think right now, even now, there are really difficult problems to solve. Usually you need some amazing engineers to do that, but yeah, it's possible.
So I think we are almost out of time. There's another very interesting question. This is also my favorite question, I have to admit, but I don't know if we can address it. So, we talked a little bit about this whole when like the private deployments, right? Single tenant deployments, dedicated, Mongo dedicated, Elastic dedicated. The question was, hey, how do we go about building this architecture on the vendor and customer side? I know of some tools, but I think the question is about like, hey, like if I want to do this, like how do I scale this? What tools do I use? How do I build this out? I'm not sure if we have the time to discuss this. We have some quick thoughts or pointers, we can put them on.
There used to be these things which are legacy now. So I'm not saying use it, but as a starting point, think about these configuration and management databases, CMDBs, right? But think about a modern way of doing that. And understand that you have to observe, provide SLOs, upgrade, potentially downgrade, roll back, and provide SLOs and SLAs to your customers as you do this. And so if you had that manager of managers system, which I call MOM, if you had that MOM system, then you could do it. And you almost have your NOC in your SaaS system where you can see every customer's health and you have a way to then manage it. It starts off pretty heavy. It has a lot more human component often early on because people are learning. But the goal needs to be to automate it as much as possible because every incremental customer you add should not add an incremental human to it.
Right.
Because then you're running a services model. So you productize all those capabilities and you go from there.
I would just suggest to the audience from my side, there's a company called Replicated.
Yes.
And they are pretty well known for, I don't know the details of the offering, but they essentially try to address this problem.
Yeah.
But there may be others.
Ex-GitLab CPO or ex-GitLab person who's the CPO there. So yeah,
awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think, we have run out of time officially. So let me pause here and hand the mic back to Pratyush, and he can figure out, where we go from here. Yeah.
Sure. I think no, thank you so much for this session. Very insightful discussion, Anoop and Joydeep. Thank you so much for the questions and the patience by the audience. I think what we can do is if there are a few unanswered questions, we will likely try and answer them async. Anyways, Anoop talked about the importance of having a good writing culture, and all of us are enthusiasts of open source. So I think that could be one way in which we can get some of those questions answered and get them back to the community. I think we'll anyways share a summary of the recording and the key takeaways with everyone for us to sort of learn from it. So I think it was a great discussion. We can formally conclude in case anyone has any very urgent question that they did not post. So you can post it here and we'll try to get them answered async by Anoop if that's the case. You anyways have Slido, so I think that should be taken care of. Thank you so much for your time, Joydeep and Anoop. Really appreciate you guys spending, for Anoop, it's pretty late night, but for Joydeep, it's a weekend morning. So I think it was a great discussion and all of us learned something for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Anoop. I think definitely learned a lot. Yeah.
Thanks. Very enjoyable. Thanks for all the questions.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.